Richard Morningstar. He's a native of Boston, Massachusetts, my place, and has had a long distinguished career in the foreign policy area. He was made ambassador to Europe in 1999, if I'm not mistaken. He was ambassador to Azerbaijan in 2012, and he was working with the Stonebridge Group, which everybody remembers was closely associated, if not started by Madeleine Albright. Did she start the Stonebridge Group, Richard?
No, it's actually started by Sandy Berger,
Mm-hmm.
and who passed away some years ago, who had been, our national security advisor. And then at some point, she had her own group, and at some point they merged. So it's now the Albright, Stonebridge Group. And of course, she passed away, as you all know, last month.
And these days, the ambassador is speaking. In fact, he spoke just yesterday at the Commerce Department. He's lectured at the Kennedy School of Government in Boston, and he's founder and head of the Global Energy Center in Washington, D.C., I take it, right?
Yeah.
Good. Well, listen, thank you for coming. And I guess I should point out you have 12 grandchildren. That impressed me.
14.
Oh, 14. Oh, I'm looking at...
And one great-grandchild.
Oh, I see. Well, my information's lagging a little bit. Anyways, welcome. And I understand you gave a speech yesterday at the Commerce Department, or a briefing. Could you give us a little piece of that, the overview of it?
Yeah, sure. Basically, what I spoke about yesterday was, given where we are because of the Ukraine war and Russia's use of continuing use of energy as a political weapon and as a way to finance the war. What is it that what do we come away with from that? What are the key points? And then how can the US and the EU and member states like Romania best cooperate?
We're not going to get too much in the nitty-gritty country by country. We're trying to keep it a little more broadly gauged. But fundamentally, how dependent is Western Europe on Russian natural gas and on Russian oil?
Well, each country is different. Overall, Central and Eastern Europe is more dependent on both gas and oil. In fact, you may have noted from the announcement of the EU of the oil embargo that exceptions were granted to Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and I think also the Czech Republic, because they're so reliant on the Druzhba oil pipeline. Also, with respect to gas, although Romania is in pretty good shape from the standpoint of energy independence, Central and Eastern Europe are generally more dependent. Western countries less so, but Germany certainly gets a lot of Russian gas, and then other countries to various degrees. But it is a real issue, and I could get into it more if you'd like. But what's fascinating is that although gas imports into Europe are beginning to decline a little bit, partly because of Russia's direct actions, that they're still making huge revenues because the price of gas is so high that even if they export less to Europe, they'll end up making more because the prices are so high, and part of that has been due to their actions.
How much is the sale of Russian gas denting the impact of the sanctions? I mean, obviously it's not a washout. Have you ever given that question some thought, or is anybody close on that particular point?
Well, different sanctions are having different effects. The energy sanctions right now are having, I would say, a marginal effect, and the question becomes, what more can be done? Oil exports have dropped off some from Russia. But on the other hand, again, the price of oil is so high, they're still getting huge revenues. the oil embargo that the EU has instituted, which would result in 90% of oil imports from Russia being eliminated by the end of the year. That's the plan. Will have an effect. But then again, some countries in Europe have received exceptions because of their basically sole reliance on gas on oil out of the Druzhba pipeline. One of the issues I think that we face in the United States is, okay, the EU has instituted this oil embargo. What do we do? What good will that? And given that oil can be shifted to other parts of the world, and the real answer would be for the U.S. to enact an Iran-type oil embargo with secondary sanctions. There are workarounds. It wouldn't totally stop it, but we have a serious political and economic problem in doing so, because it would force the price of gasoline even higher. And given the inflation situation, and frankly, coupled with the political situation of the midterms coming up, that would be hard for the administration to take that step. And I'm a little bit surprised that I've even heard less talk of the U.S. oil embargo. But I think those are the issues that the administration is facing. Gas is a whole different kettle of fish, given Europe's reliance and the reluctance on Europe to actually issue an embargo. They're making commitments as to reductions, but the Russians can still make a lot of money on gas, even when they're spasmodically shutting off gas to various parts of Europe for not buying gas with rubles or for whatever reason they think of, at the time. But there's still.
You give us the feeling that in a way, the sanctions might be hurting the people who wish to impose those sanctions, such as the West and Germany, more than it's hurting the Russians.
Right, and President Biden even said right at the beginning of the war that we're going to have to pay a price to support Ukraine and to show Russia that it has to apply by some kind of rules of order. But the question is how much of a price, and it's really biting people at home now. It's not just the Ukraine war that's causing that, but it's a contributing factor.
America, of course, is a huge, the largest energy producer in the world. How much can the United States step in, such as with LNG? I know there are large LNG terminals in the northern part of Europe, and maybe they could go into the Black Sea. I don't know what it takes to get those things going. How realistic can the United States ease the situation for Europe, Western Europe?
Well, it certainly can be a big help, but probably alone is not sufficient. U.S. LNG exports to Europe have gone up by a huge amount over the last year. Because I don't have numbers in front of me, I hate to give a specific number, but my memory is something like 60% through the first 4 or 5 months. Don't hold me to that. And that we have to encourage those exports. And it makes the point. Let me make a few basic points, and it relates to U.S. LNG and gas and so forth. I think the first thing that we learn from what's happening with respect to Ukraine, that Europe once and for all has to eliminate its dependence on Russian energy. End of case. It just has to happen. But the second point that I think is important, and this relates to gas, that energy security and the energy transition should not be viewed as an either-or proposition. That you can't have, if you're producing gas, that's going to have a huge negative effect on the energy transition. That that because it doesn't need to. And gas in Europe is going to be very important, certainly for the short to midterm. And we have to make every effort to decarbonize gas through and can cooperate with Europe in doing so. Metrics to reduce methane emissions, flaring, carbon capture, various things that can help to decarbonize gas. But overall, it seems to me we do need to double down on the energy transition from both a climate standpoint and an energy security standpoint, because the more green energy, apart from its value on climate, it's going to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and particularly on Russian fuels. And one of the issues I think that we've been facing here, and going back to the point of the importance of LNG exports, that the messaging from the administration has been confused. It's better. I think it's a lot better now. But the administration has to make clear that gas and energy exports, including oil, are critical from a national security standpoint. And that it's not an either or situation. We still need to double down on the energy transition, but this message has to be clear to producers, to investors.
When you say double down, like you just did, double down on this transition, I get the sense that you've drawn the conclusion that the Western countries haven't moved quick enough, and certainly they don't seem to be singing exactly the same tune in dealing with Russia and dealing with Ukraine. Is that an exaggeration, or?
No, it's not an exaggeration, but it's also, I don't want to give the impression that Europe has done nothing. There have been changes in Europe, basically since this became a bigger issue. Let's say 2009, when Russia cut off gas through Ukraine, and people in countries like Bulgaria froze, and actions have been taken. But yes, there needs to be more that's done, and the U.S. and the EU and member states, including obviously Romania, have to be part of that.
There was a piece in the New York Times yesterday, in fact, about how Romania which gets 20% of its energy from nuclear energy, and Cernavodă here in Romania, is wishing to expand here in Romania, and also could be of some help in getting the foot off the neck here and loosening up energy supplies in the form of nuclear energy. Do you think that's realistic?
Yeah, I think it is. I think Romania is doing overall a good job, and I think it can play an important role. The relationship between Romania and the United States is excellent, and energy is an area for major cooperation. Nuclear is one area. I think that the MOU between the U.S. and Romania, and with NuScale to develop small modular nuclear reactors, are very important. Working with American companies with respect to existing and revamping existing nuclear plants, also very important. Romania, I think, can play a very significant role with respect to gas in a couple of ways. Soon there'll be the Greece-Bulgaria interconnector, which can bring gas on into Romania and can be a source of significant amounts of LNG from the U.S. And from other sources. Romania, I think, is getting its act together with respect to Black Sea gas. It's too bad that Exxon went away because of problems with the legislation. But I think that's getting straightened out and can be a significant contributor. Back when I was Hillary Clinton's energy envoy, I spent a lot of time in Romania encouraging the development of shale. And I know that is not particularly popular from an environmental standpoint, but it can be controlled. And I think that's also something that should should continue to be looked at. And I think Romania is in a good situation that it's not as vulnerable as some of its neighbors with respect to energy, and it does have an important role to play.
Well, very good points. I mean, I think we've certainly given something for everybody to chew on, and I bet you there's some questions. So I want to just turn it over to some of our members and donors for questions from their perspective. We've touched on the wide scope of this subject here. Luca, do you have anybody there?
Nobody has asked any questions in the comments, but Chang has a question, and I want to invite Chang to, who's one of our board members at Alianza, to join us on camera and ask her question directly. You're on mute, so.
Okay, Chang, over to you.
Hi. Good morning or good afternoon, Ambassador Morningstar. Good to see you again. I do have a question. Actually, two questions, but let me start with LNG question. Especially with this war in the region and the energy crisis in Europe, many countries, perhaps not so much Romania because of its domestic resources, but a lot of the countries in Eastern European side of the continent are looking to build LNG terminals. And just like you said, yes, we have to double down, we have to export more, but without the terminal on the other side, it would be difficult to do so. The problem with somebody like Bulgaria is the fact that as long as Turkey, Erdogan does not allow LNG vessels to go through Bosphorus, it would be difficult to build anything in Bulgaria, which is why I believe gas trade, the Greeks have built Alexandroupolis. So do you think there's any possibility that US or the international community can persuade Erdogan to open up that Bosphorus route?
You know, I've been asked that question for, in fact, it was an issue even going back to when I was working on the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline back at the end of the 90s, when Turkey didn't want any more large oil tankers going through the Bosporus. The answer is, I doubt it. It has been a consistent policy of Turkey for years and years and years. And if you may have been on the shores of the Bosporus, it's a very narrow channel, and I can understand that big, huge LNG tankers going through the Bosporus could freak people out there. And so it is an environmental question, but even more a political question. And I think it would be very difficult. But that's why I mentioned Greece and the Greece-Bulgaria interconnector, and Alexandroupolis, as you mentioned, being built. They have another terminal as well. And if that can be an expanded pipeline and connect easily from Bulgaria to Romania, and then maybe if further on into Europe, that can be a major help. And that's what I think that if things go right, Romania could be a major player in the region with respect to energy. And also,
go on.
No, and I come back to the need for Black Sea gas and off of the Romanian coast, but then there's also a lot now being developed off the Turkish coast, Black Sea coast, which might become available in the next year or so, which also could come through Romania. So anyway.
I was saying, which, quite aside from the Turkish situation, I don't see the Russians particularly amenable to the idea of big LNG ports lining along the Black Sea coast, particularly where you have mines floating around. You have Russia taking further control of the northern part of the Black Sea with their advance. I see it as a highly unlikely scenario, wouldn't you say?
Not necessarily. I'd want to look more at the geography.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to blockade Ukraine and have mines in and around Ukrainian ports. It would be another thing for them to interfere with energy coming into NATO countries like Romania and Bulgaria. And that would be, it's possible they would, but that would be difficult. Now, whether they would use whether they have enough political influence still in these countries to, to threaten behind the scenes, and that thing, I don't know. One of the things that one of the things that people have talked about is taking the Trans-Balkan pipeline, which brought gas from Russia south to Turkey through the Balkan countries, and has been discarded because of Turk Stream. There's been talk about having a reverse flow back into Balkan countries. Again, the same question that that Russia would certainly politically would maybe make that impossible.
We saw another question in there. Chang, did you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, well, it's a different question since you mentioned Chernavoda. Ambassador Morningstar, you're very familiar with Romania. In fact, I met you first time in Romania. I've been working on Chernavoda for now almost 4 years, making it really officially a G2G project now. We have refurbishment to reactor number 1 and completion of 3 and 4. Of course, refurbishment is definitely and urgently needed, but as Romanian government is looking for private investment in the completion of 3 and 4, I'm just wondering, do you think it would be ever possible to convince Romanian legislators to pass some kind of a PPA, power purchase agreement? They even talked about contract for difference, but do you think that will ever be passed, or do we have to wait another 8-10 years, just like the offshore law, to pass such a legislation in Romania? Thank you very much.
Well, some of you, including yourself, Chang, would be more qualified than I am to answer that question. I know that Romanian domestic politics are very difficult. My hope would be that the Ukraine war has changed the situation to such an extent that legislators would be more welcome to these kinds of agreements. I think that it's also critically important. There are 2 other issues, and again, I don't consider myself an expert on it, but I think it's critically important to work with Western companies on the nuclear issues. I know Westinghouse is involved, and the other issue is fuel. Where will these plants get their fuel from? I will admit my ignorance. I'm not sure where Romania is getting their nuclear fuel from now. I assume probably Russia. No, where are they getting it from?
Romania has domestic source.
It has its, and so it does. Well, I'm glad to. Thanks. I'm glad to know that. But they have enough domestic nuclear fuel to operate the plants.
Yeah, and unlike the Westinghouse or the light water reactor, the Romanian Chernavoda, they're all CANDU units.
Right.
So they have heavy water.
Well, you clearly know more about the specifics than I do. So.
Well, we can throw questions either way. In the meantime, we have Alan Cruz waiting for a question. Alan, are you there still?
Yeah, and I'd like to invite Alan to join us and ask the question himself.
My question is, I try to follow the news every day about the situation in Ukraine with regard to Russia, but I find oftentimes the reporting is contradictory from various news sources. And so my question was, which sources can we rely on for a true picture about the situation in Ukraine and with regard to the war?
Good question, and that's maybe the nature of war. For example, not that it's a great news outlet, but I still have one of the few people that still has a Yahoo email account, and so every day I get these clips that relate to Ukraine, and most of them come from Ukrainian sources, which I'm beginning not to pay a whole lot of attention to, because as the nature of the beast, I'm sure that it's exaggerated. I think that the Defense Department tries to be straightforward. I think that the commentators that I generally see on U.S. outlets seem to have a grasp on the situation. And as far as I can tell, and what I keep hearing, is that after the heady days of the beginning of the war, when the Russians were forced to retreat from Kyiv, that they are making progress in eastern Ukraine, and that Ukraine needs more arms and ammunition, and that we are going to be in for a long slog, and that that's the best I think that's the general consensus at this point. You're right. Anybody who's reporting on a war, particularly from whether it's from Ukraine or obviously Russia's going to distort things. It's going to be distorted.
Waluka.
Well, I think Obi has a question, and then we can also, if we have time, we'll take a question from Facebook. But Obi, can you join us to ask your question?
Yeah. Hi, Ambassador Morningstar, Obi Moore. We've also met in Romania and Atlantic Council events and so on over the years.
Right.
My concern is that as this war drags on and continues, and everyone seems to feel it's going to be a long haul. Do you see this sanctioned coalition of countries sustaining their cooperation, coordination of efforts, and to ensure that there's energy supplies that meet both consumer and business needs while eliminating eventually all sources of Russian energy? And are there likely defectors in this effort, such as countries like Hungary or perhaps others?
Well, yeah, what you raise is certainly an important issue, and I think we're even beginning to see some fraying. I think it was helpful today that the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and I may be missing a country, went to Kyiv to assure Zelensky of support. What I think the most immediate need is that the countries stay together with respect to military exports into Ukraine. And I read an interesting article in the New York Times yesterday, and a lot of concern that Scholz, the chancellor, in spite of the apparent reversal of views with respect to Russia after the war, that arms shipments are necessary arms shipments from Germany still haven't gotten there. And I think that the most important area that we need to remain unified is from a security standpoint and arming Ukraine. As far as energy is concerned, yeah, I think that there is a lot of pressure resulting from the present economic issues, inflation issues, and so forth, and how much punishment are countries and citizens willing to take. There was a poll that came out, I think today, I think it was in Germany, where 30% said that there ought to be some settlement, even if Ukraine has to give up territory because of the economic effects. And so I think it's going to be a continuing battle to maintain unity. I think the U.S. has to be the leader in maintaining that unity. And the thing that does worry me a little bit is that how far do we get to a low, how low is the lowest common denominator that allows unity to continue? I think that Western unity is critical, but that has to be balanced against, other questions. For example, should the U.S. enact a very tough oil embargo with secondary sanctions, and would that risk unity with EU allies? Exceptions could be given to European countries. So yeah, it's I don't know what more to say about it, except it's going to be a constant battle. It's going to take a lot of work. I think the administration, from that standpoint, has done a pretty good job in helping to maintain unity. But again, it's at what price is that unity going to be?
If I could have just a quick follow on, and thanks for that answer. It is troubling and concerning, but I do hope that this sanctioned coalition is able to stay together and that we're able to expand it even beyond the United States and Western Europe to other countries that, like Singapore and others that support the rules-based order of global values and institutions. What about China? How it fits into this concern? Because I could foresee that as the war drags on, the European countries start to become impatient and start to suffer domestically, and then elections enter into it and so on. And then China steps in and starts to fill the void of the effects of this cutoff of oil and gas from Russia to Western Europe. And then the intended effects of this sanctions coalition of cutting off energy supplies begins to not have much of an effect anymore. And then my concern would be that would then be a trigger for this sanctions coalition of mostly Western countries then to start to dissolve and weaken, if not break up. Is that something you could foresee?
Well, yeah, no, I think you're right that is that is potentially a big problem, and I do think that China already is trying to fill the gap, particularly on oil and gas. The other side of that, and also don't forget India. That's just as tough as China, and they've been just as reluctant to take any actions with respect to Russian imports. So those two countries alone are substantial and can help buffer the loss of Russian loss of exports, and to an extent the loss of revenue. But and it is true that China and India can't match, are not a total substitute for what Russia's losing in Europe. Certainly with respect to gas, which is primarily goes to China, not in huge amounts right now. But even with respect to oil, much more is going to Europe than was going to China or India. China and India also face the problem of what's their relationship with the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, where they get a lot of their oil from, and are they going to reduce oil from there in order to take it from Russia, and what does that mean with respect to those longer term relationships? So it is complicated, and it comes back to should the U.S. With some kind of agreement from Europe enact its own embargo and with secondary sanctions, and they can probably work around that too, but it would make it, India and China would make it more difficult. So it is a real question, and a serious question that you are totally right in identifying. I would say that it's nuanced without totally clear black and white answers.
Ambassador, you said earlier that you sort of believe in geography. How, if China wanted to help out Russia, how do they get Russian gas as a practical matter from Russia to China, given the geography of the world?
Well, it's hard. There is, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, the Power of Siberia or something Siberia pipeline, which does ship some gas into China now. They want to expand that and expand the gas purchases. China is also a tough bargainer. There have never been major agreements with Russia until now because Russia won't accept, or China won't accept Russia's prices. So all that has to work out. I think on the gas side, which is a lot harder with respect to any kind of embargo, particularly in Europe for all the reasons we talked about, that it's going to be a while before China can really substitute in any meaningful way for European gas, if gas to Europe, if in fact Europe stopped buying from Russia. And I think the key with respect to Europe is for them to get those purchases down as quickly as possible through any number of steps, including more LNG, including better infrastructure, including again doubling down immediately on green technologies like renewables. There's a lot to be gained with respect to energy efficiency in European countries. So there are things that can be done, but it's going to be tough. And we'll see how it plays out.
Chang, did I see you with a question there, or Raluca, did you have something else queued up?
We do have a couple of questions on Facebook. Maybe we can take one of them. Darren Ray Smith is asking. So he says, I think that Prime Minister Chuka is the perfect Romanian leader at an important time in the region's history. What specific policy moves and commercial advocacy could PM Chuka engage in to strongly advance Romania's position as a primary energy provider for Europe? And just as a reminder to everybody in the meeting, you can raise your hand, ask a question in the comments, and pop up to chat with the ambassador.
Well, I think again that I don't even pretend in any way to be an expert on Romanian domestic politics. Yeah. But I think that Romania has been racked with political divisions for a long time. And we can say the same about the United States. So it's not unusual. But anything that he can do to unify the country and to develop a unified policy to develop the goals that we've talked about before with respect to nuclear, with respect to importing LNG, through infrastructure, with respect to the green transition. And Romania is in a good position for solar and particularly wind energy off of the Black Sea. So I think a unified approach to deal with these issues would be, including offshore tax and so forth, would be critical.
Mr. Ambassador, early on you were saying that it's important for the West to keep this coalition together, to double down. What do you make of Henry Kissinger's comments at Davos that the West should try to stop trying to inflict pain on Russia, which will lead to instability across Europe? And he made the point that Russia, after all, for the last 200 or 300 years, of course, has been a major feature in West European and often in European history and often in the interest of the United States. Just think of the world wars. And he's sort of saying, rather than putting so much pressure on Putin, we should put a little more pressure on Zelensky to curb his war aims. What do you think of his comments, Kissinger's comments?
Well, I think that's early to be talking like that. And I understand that Henry Kissinger is 99 years old. He certainly has a lot of experience. And I think his concerns, which are reasonable and, I think have to be dealt with, is that, there are dangers to humiliating Putin and putting him in a corner. And who knows how far Putin would go in using nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction or cyber, other things that he could conceivably do. And so that's a risk. But that's a risk that we're going to have to live with. It doesn't mean we should back down. I think we have to see how things unfold over the coming months. If it looks like any kind that it is absolutely impossible militarily for Ukraine to recoup all of its territories, is that something that we need to think about, or is a long-term semi-frozen conflict without a treaty, but with Russia occupying good parts of the Donbass and Luhansk? Is that tolerable? All of those are important issues. So in principle, I think that that one of the factors that we need to consider is what Kissinger says, but it's not the only factor. And I would strongly argue that now is the time not to show weakness. Let's do everything we can to help Ukraine and see how things unfold. And whether things are the same in 6 months or a year from now, I'm sure there'll be a lot of facts on the ground, even in Russia, that we can't even predict today. So let's see what happens.
If the war slogs on like you predicted in its way it's sort of happened in the last 4 weeks, and we go through the summer and we go into a winter of 2022, 2023, from a living point of view, are you getting a little bit pessimistic that we're going to be going through a good deal more pain than we imagine right now, if the war continues at the pace it's at now?
It's unpredictable. It's certainly possible. We could be living through even higher gas prices, energy shortages. Risks could become higher. Although on the other hand, it could drift off into a state of perpetual stalemate, and it's impossible to. It's hard to predict. There certainly are risks, but I don't think anybody, including me, knows enough to really adequately predict that.
Looking backwards, I suppose in the last few months, to ease the current situation, Western countries have been drawing down on reserves, I guess, gas and oil to sort of ease the situation. And apparently those reserves have been depleted by 9%. Is that a correct figure? And how long could these reserves sort of keep us going?
I'll take the figure at face value. The reserves can help, but obviously not on a permanent basis. The biggest issue from a reserve standpoint that Europe needs to work on is gas. And fortunately, they started off with a significant amount of gas in storage, but that's coming down dramatically. And how are they going to fill their storage tanks for next winter is a very serious question. And that's why LNG in the short term is so critical, as well as in the short term, trying to reduce demand could have a significant effect.
Luca, any questions on your side?
We have one more question on Facebook, but we're also kind of 15 minutes away from the top of the hour, so just wanted to do a quick time check. And this question is also from Darren, who says, when nefarious actors threatened the Persian Gulf commercial maritime traffic years ago, an international coalition provided naval escorts to guarantee commercial activities weren't interrupted. Shouldn't the international community band together to open all Black Sea ports to legitimate commercial traffic by a large coalition of partners, providing naval escorts to these vessels for food, fuel, and basic commerce?
Well, ideally, yes. And it's something that has to be seriously considered. And again, it's a question of weighing risk. and is the risk worth taking? And that I think certainly in theory, and certainly ought to be seriously considered, escorting ships, particularly out of Odessa, clearing mines and exporting ships. If we believe it's worth the risk, would be very important. One of the intangibles is Turkey, and in order to do that, Turkey would have to let military ships go through the Bosporus, and that's a very serious question. Turkey has been talking with Russia about some way of opening up Ukrainian ports to ship grain and so forth. And the problem there is, what will Russia, even if that's feasible, what will Russia extract as quid pro quo in order to do that? And I don't think we want to get into a bargaining situation where Russia says, "Oh yeah, sure, we'll let the grain go out, we'll let exports go out, but then you have to drop the sanctions," that type of thing. And we sure don't want to get into that kind of situation.
Chris Coutts said the other day that Putin is counting on the West to lose focus. Do you share his concern?
Well, it goes back to questions, comments that have made before as to whether we can keep the alliance together. He's clearly going to say that, and we just have to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. Raluca, you were saying something just there.
Chang, do you want to join us to ask your question? And then Obi has one final question also.
Yeah. Hi, Ambassador. Just one more question. Well, actually, I have a comment also to the previous question regarding naval escort. Before we get into naval escorts, I think it's important to understand the realities here. There's so much more that Romania can do to alleviate the traffic on the Danube in order to, evacuate all the 25 million tons of grains that are in silos in Ukraine. And somehow the Romanian government is just not moving fast enough, in my opinion, since I'm in that business. But question is Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, two countries very, very familiar. You're familiar with, and that is Kazmunai gas is sort of waiting and not actively involved in supplying any meaningful.
I'm sorry, who's gas?
Kazmunai gas.
Okay.
From Kazakhstan.
Okay.
Do you think? What do you think about Silkar and the Azeris? Are they also sort of waiting around the sideline, looking to see what they should do because of possible retribution from Russia? Or do you feel that this Azeris may look at this as sort of an opportunity for them to step up and play a little bit more of a leadership role with a supply of their products?
Another good question. All the questions are really good questions. My feeling is that Azerbaijan would both want to thread the needle and not risk serious retribution from the Russians, but also would love to take advantage of it. I think the best way they could take advantage of it would be by more Azeri gas, which I think is possible, which could be shipped through existing pipelines. It might involve some expansion in some places. As far as gas coming directly from Kazakhstan, I thought you were going to mention Turkmenistan, I think that would be extremely difficult. And not necessarily from a technical standpoint, but I worked for years on trying to get Turkmenistan to agree to ship gas to a Trans-Caspian pipeline. And I finally said it would not happen while I'm alive. Well, I'm 77 years old, so I'm getting a little worried about that. I'd be, if all of a sudden there was a Trans-Caspian pipeline, I would be putting my affairs in order. But but in all seriousness, I think that really is a Russian red line, and they've always said that. Even though boundary issues have finally been pretty much resolved, Russia has made clear, it's one thing for gas coming from Azerbaijan, but for gas to come from Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan would be a totally different story. And I think it could get to the point where Russia would literally interdict any work in the Caspian on that. And I frankly, I don't think there's much we could do about it, not in the landlocked Caspian.
Well, considering Turkmenistan's new president, the son, newly elected president, his first overseas trip was to Russia,
right?
To meet with Mr. Putin. I don't think we should hold our breaths.
I think I can live to be at least 100 years old. So.
Obi also had a question.
Yeah, Obi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, John. Ambassador Morningstar, just, I'm aware of your participation on the Stanford working group on Russian sanctions and an action plan. And one of the things that I understood that was in that, at least in the first draft, was the thoughts about trying to eliminate revenue that gets immediately to Russia that finances its war effort in Ukraine. And one of the thoughts was to impose on the sanctioned coalition members the obligation to those countries that continue to pay for imports of oil and gas from Russia to put those funds in escrow and hold them until the war effort is until the war is resolved, and even to try and direct them to humanitarian relief in Ukraine or reconstruction of Ukraine at some point. I recognize that's a lofty ambition, but I'm curious to know if you've seen any sites of those efforts being put in place. Is that something that's realistic?
Yeah, one, I haven't seen it from governments. It's something that gets talked about among, the think tank community and so forth. My own personal view is that it's totally unrealistic. That it would be virtually, let's say, very difficult to implement it in a way that would be meaningful. You'd still have India and China buying gas, maybe at a discount. But there still would be a lot, or oil for that matter. There would be a lot being sold. And I ask the simple question: why would Russia play in that game? I mean, why would they ever? Why would they ever? I mean, can you imagine Putin shipping gas to countries where the payments were being put in escrow? I mean, there's as much chance of that as me. I'm actually on our ground floor right now, but if I was in our office on the 12th floor, it'd be as likely as me jumping out of the window and being able to fly. So realistically, I think it's fine to talk about these things, but it would be a very difficult proposition. Yeah. There's some talk about price caps, and there are two issues with respect to that. One, let's say that there was that Europe couldn't buy gas at greater than $60, or oil. Oil at greater than $60 a barrel. Fine, that reduces revenues. But hey, Russia was selling oil at $30 or $40 a barrel, a few years ago, and surviving. And would it force other countries like India and China to one? You couldn't enforce it, but they might have to face heavier discount or require heavier discounts from Russia. But still, Russia would be getting a lot of revenues. And would Russia play in the game? So I think that what we need to do is reduce imports from Russia as much as possible. Ideally, with a full oil embargo, which for the reasons we talked about could be somewhat difficult, and recognizing that gas is going to be reduced over some period of time. But ultimately eliminating that dependence.
Yeah, do you think that there is on this action plan by the Stanford Working Group, has there been a second draft that's been produced from that?
I'm on that group.
Yeah, I know.
And have stated my views. What they're doing on now, and there's some on their website, is more specific. There's no second paper of the overall situation, overall sanction situation, but work is being done on the individual areas in a more specific way. In fact, there are some calls today on some papers. So it's working, and I think it's valuable. It gives ideas, and we'll see what we'll go from there.
Yeah. No, it's helpful. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, when we think back over this conversation, we've touched on so many subjects: other energy sources, the inflation factor, the shock at the pump in the United States and Europe, sanctions, whether they're really working, the slight nuances between, let's say, a Macron and a Boris Johnson, the unity of Europe in that sense, US elections coming up. And you've had a lot of experience trying to bring countries together around energy needs. If you look ahead and reflecting back on what we've discussed here, and we've discussed most of your life, would you count yourself in this situation as optimistic or cautiously so, uneasy or worried about where we find ourselves right now?
I'm both uneasy and cautiously optimistic. The biggest concern I have, one, diplomacy is obviously going to be critically important, particularly with our allies. And what concerns me, along with being cautiously optimistic, as I mentioned before, how low is the lowest common denominator? And what do we have to give up from an energy sanctions standpoint, or taking actions against Russia on energy to maintain that unity? And I do think the unity is absolutely critical because at the end of the day, certainly for the immediate future, the security aspect and getting a united approach with respect to arms exports and weapons exports to Ukraine right today is the singularly most important thing. I think a lot of the steps that have been taken will have even what we've done already, including bans on exports to Russia of critical materials that they need, financial sanctions and so forth, will have a very serious long-term effect, mid to long-term effect on Russia. But I don't know that anything is happening now from a sanction standpoint that, for now anyway, would be changing Russian behavior. We just have to keep pushing to give Ukraine as much help as we can.
Well, on that note, I think we're right up the top of the hour, and I'd like to thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it's fantastic. You made reference to your age, but you're like a 50-year-old. You're right on top of everything. You seem to be all over the country, so that's reassuring. And I thank you for your input.